In the heart of ancient Persia, beneath the shadow of a sacred mountain, a city was built not for mortals, but for memory. Its creators called it Parsa. We know it as Persepolis. It was carved from limestone and sunlight, a place where empire became architecture and ceremony became faith. Here, kings once spoke to gods in the language of order, and the world answered in tribute. This is not the story of ruin. From empire to ash, from myth to rediscovery, this is the journey of the city that taught the world how beauty survives oblivion. They said no one could unite the Persians. Too many tribes, too many loyalties to mountain and clan, too many memories of feuds older than their own kings. No one noticed when the balance of the world began to shift. There was no comet, no divine omen above the mountains of Persia, only a man who refused to remain small. In the middle of the 6th century before Christ, Cyrus, son of Cambyses, stepped out from a cluster of hill tribes and began to imagine something that had never existed. A single empire drawn from 100 tongues and loyalties. The world around him, Media, Lydia, Babylon, was rich and old, but exhausted. Kingdoms ruled by inheritance, not vision. Cyrus was not the strongest of them, nor the richest, but he was the first to see beyond the next victory. Persia then was a patchwork of names. Pasargadae, Marathi, Maspai, Sagarti, Pantialai, Darusiai. Tribes of herders and riders who shared blood only in myth and quarrels. They fought one another, traded one another, sometimes forgot they were even neighbors. To unite them was absurd, and yet Cyrus did. He bound them not by threats, but by a kind of pact, that loyalty to one another could bring security none had ever known. The alliance began as a whisper, agreements sealed by handshakes and feasts, but it hardened into order. Out of it came a kingdom with discipline, a people who called themselves the Persians. They were not chosen by the gods. They were chosen by circumstance, by the man who convinced them they could be more than their mountains. Cyrus's first campaign was against his grandfather, Astyages, king of the Medes. It was a rebellion that should have ended in his death. Instead, when the two armies met, the Median ranks broke, not under force, but through sympathy. Many of Astyages' soldiers turned their spears, unwilling to die for a weary despot. The fall of Media was not a massacre, but a transfusion. The blood of the old kingdom flowed into the new. That victory revealed what would make Cyrus different. Where others conquered to plunder, he conquered to absorb. He kept the Median administrators, respected their customs, and ruled through persuasion as much as command. Every land he touched became another pillar of his growing design. From the north, his eyes turned west. There, Croesus of Lydia, famed for his gold, ruled behind high walls and the promise of divine favor. He was the richest man alive and thought himself untouchable. When the oracle of Delphi warned him that attacking Persia would destroy a great empire, he heard only what he wanted. He did destroy one. It just wasn't Cyrus's. At Thymbra, the Persian lines held against Lydian chariots. Croesus fled to Sardis, his capital, believing winter would save him. But Cyrus moved faster than winter. The city fell in days. And again, instead of vengeance, he offered clemency. Croesus lived, stripped of his throne, but not his dignity. From that moment, rumors spread that Cyrus was favored by all gods, not merely his own. East of Lydia lay the impossible prize, Babylon, the city of kings, whose walls were said to defy the sky. Its ruler, Nabonidus, had alienated priests and people alike, retreating into divine obsession. When Cyrus's forces reached the Euphrates in 539 BC, the great city opened its gates. Not a siege, not a sack, an entry. The Persians walked its processional road while the citizens watched in relief. Cyrus entered the temple of Marduk as a liberator, not a conqueror. His scribes recorded it on a clay cylinder, later buried beneath the walls. I restored to the gods the sanctuaries that had fallen to ruin. I returned the people to their homes. The language was deliberate. It spoke to Babylonians, to Jews, to every subject who feared a stranger's rule. It said, "Your gods are safe with me." From Babylon to the Indus, from Sardis to Sogdia, the empire spread like a careful breath, each conquest folded into administration. Gold flowed through Persian hands, but so did information. Couriers rode from one end of the realm to the other, carrying sealed tablets, orders, and reports. The empire was not yet perfected, that would come later, but its spine had formed. A network, a rhythm, a faith in structure. In those years, Cyrus began to shape something subtler than power. He built at Pasargadae, not a fortress, but a gardened capital, open to the plain. Its terraces blended styles from every land he had taken. Babylonian columns, Median layouts, Lydian ornamentation. It was less a city than an argument. That beauty itself could be imperial. This vision would outlive him. It would evolve into the perfection his descendants would carve into the stone terraces of Persepolis. Cyrus ruled not through spectacle, but through predictability. He understood that an empire survives only when its people can expect tomorrow to resemble today. He reformed tribute systems, standardized coinage, and respected local laws. To many, he became not a conqueror, but a stabilizer, the man who ended uncertainty. Even those who had fought him began to see Persian rule as the lesser chaos. His death came far from the heartland, in the east, on campaign among restless tribes who refused submission. There was no triumphal procession back to the capital, no vast pyre, only a return of his body to Pasargadae. His tomb stood on a simple stone base, gabled like a shepherd's house. When the Greek Aryan visited centuries later, he claimed the inscription once read, "O man, whoever you are, I am Cyrus, who founded the empire of the Persians. Do not begrudge me this earth that covers my body. It suited him. No marble excess, no divine boast, just endurance." After his death, the empire did not unravel. The administration he had built kept moving. Letters dispatched, governors obeying, taxes recorded. His son, Cambyses, would take Egypt. Others would extend Persian rule even farther. But the pattern remained his. A balance between order and mercy, between the sword and the scribe. In the courtyards of Pasargadae, where artisans still cut stone for unfinished halls, the workers said the king's voice could be heard when the wind crossed the hills. They meant it as a blessing. A man who had turned tribes into a nation should not vanish so easily. And in those same valleys, long after his body was sealed in its tomb, new architects began to dream. A city larger, higher, and more enduring than any before. Not a capital of men, but of meaning. What Cyrus began in mortar, others would complete in marble. And when Cyrus fell, the empire did not crumble, but it did tremble. His son Cambyses marched into Egypt, triumphant and unpredictable. Far behind him, the machinery of government began to creak. The nobles whispered, the satraps hesitated, and in the vacuum, left by conquest, ambition grew teeth. Out of this uncertainty stepped a man whose name would redefine kingship. Darius, son of Hystaspes, a lesser prince of the Achaemenid line who claimed, with startling conviction, that the gods themselves had chosen him. He was not the natural heir. His rise began in conspiracy, forged in a moment when the empire seemed adrift. Cambyses died on campaign, perhaps by accident, perhaps not. And in the chaos, a pretender seized the throne. The intruder claimed to be Bardia, Cyrus's younger son. He looked the part, spoke the part, and for months the court obeyed him. But Darius knew the truth. The real Bardia was already dead. The man in power was an imposter. That revelation set in motion one of the most decisive gambits in Persian history. Darius gathered 6 nobles loyal to him, rode to the capital, and stormed the palace. The false king fell beneath their blades. At dawn, Darius emerged as ruler, not by inheritance, but by audacity. His first act was to define his victory not as rebellion, but restoration. The inscription he later carved into the rock at Behistun would proclaim it forever. Ahura Mazda bore me aid. The lie was crushed. The Behistun relief, chiseled hundreds of feet above the plain, shows Darius standing tall, 1 foot on the fallen usurper, with 9 rebel kings bound before him. Above them, the winged symbol of Ahura Mazda, god of truth and light, sanctions his rule. It is more than propaganda. It is theology cast in stone. Darius presented himself not as conqueror, but as cosmic custodian, the chosen instrument of divine order. From that belief would emerge his empire's unshakable structure. Where Cyrus built through trust, Darius built through system. He divided the vast territories into satrapies, each governed by a satrap, protector of the realm, responsible for taxes, law, and loyalty. Over them, royal inspectors, the king's eyes, travelled without warning to report directly to the throne. The new monarch knew that bureaucracy was more reliable than blood. Kinship could rebel, paperwork could not. He standardized coinage, the Daric, stamped in gold with his image, and opened a royal highway that stitched the empire together from Sardis to Susa, nearly 1,700 miles of guarded road and rest stations. Couriers could carry messages faster than any army could march. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night would stop them, wrote later admirers. Darius had turned geography into governance. In these reforms, he revealed his temperament, not the dreamer Cyrus had been, but a builder of permanence. He understood that power meant little without language, record, and repetition. To administer peoples who spoke a dozen tongues, he created a written bureaucracy based on imperial Aramaic, practical and portable, used from Egypt to the Indus. The tablets found centuries later in the ruins of Persepolis, thousands of them bear witness to this revolution. Orders for rations, allocations of silver, names of workers, festivals, births, deaths. Together they form not just paperwork, but pulse, the heartbeat of empire made visible. Darius's vision extended to faith as well. The old gods were tolerated, as Cyrus had decreed, but he elevated one above all, Ahura Mazda, the embodiment of truth and creation. In his inscriptions, he declared that the king ruled by the will of the wise Lord, and that the greatest sin was the lie, the falsehood that corrupted both soul and state. The moral became political. To serve the king was to defend truth itself. Even rebellion in this theology was heresy. From this fusion of faith and governance, Darius sought to shape not only obedience, but belief. He called his subjects Bandaka, servants of the king, bound not by chains, but duty. In return, he promised stability, prosperity, and justice. It was a social contract, unlike any the ancient world had seen, and it worked. Yet for all his order, Darius remained restless. Administration alone could not symbolize empire. It needed a body, a visible form, he found it in a project of staggering ambition, a new ceremonial center built not for residence or war, but for permanence. Near the mountains of Marv Dasht, where the light falls gold across the plain, he chose the site that would become Persepolis. The dream was unprecedented. Unlike Pasargadae, which was open and pastoral, this would be a stage upon which the empire itself could appear. Architects and artisans were summoned from every corner of the realm, stonemasons from Sardis, goldsmiths from Egypt, carpenters from Babylon, sculptors from Bactria. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, but all worked under the same order. Darius demanded perfection, and the tablets suggest he paid for it. Workers received rations of wine and grain, not lashes. Construction began around 518 BC. The platform alone covered over 100,000 square meters, raised on a terrace of stone and packed earth. Beneath it ran drains and channels to guard against flood and earthquake, proof that engineering was as sacred as ritual. On its surface rose palaces, halls, and columned chambers, each designed with mathematical precision. The Apadana, the grand audience hall, could hold 10,000 people and was supported by columns 20 meters high. Lions and bulls crowned their capitals, symbols of power and restraint locked in eternal balance. At the foundation of this city, Darius buried a pair of gold and silver tablets, engraved in 3 languages. They declare, Darius the Great King says, "By the favor of Ahura Mazda, this palace I built. May it protect me and my house." The words are not mere dedication, they are prayer and philosophy joined. He built Persepolis not to rule from, but to be remembered through. It was to be the empire's face to eternity. While the stones rose, his armies kept the borders alive. Revolts in Elam, Babylon, and Egypt were crushed swiftly. In the east, campaigns reached as far as India, securing tributary kings. To the west, his ships explored the Aegean, mapping lands that would later tempt his son. But for Darius, conquest was never an end in itself. It was validation. Each victory proved that his vision of divine order was correct. When he marched, he carried not only weapons, but ideology. And yet, behind that calm architecture of rule, there was unease. The more vast the empire became, the more it depended on the idea of the king as infallible. Darius's inscriptions never admit error, only the lie that others spread. His order was magnificent but fragile, reliant on constant belief in his perfection. Perhaps he knew this. Perhaps that is why he built so much stone, to make permanent what human loyalty could never fully guarantee. He died in 486 BC, leaving behind a realm that stretched from the Nile to the Oxus, from the Aegean to the mountains of India. His tomb at Naqsh-e-Rustam, carved high into the cliff face, shows him standing on a platform upheld by the peoples of the world, each nation rendered in miniature, lifting the weight of empire. It is an image of absolute harmony and absolute dependence. When they sealed his tomb, the workers carved one final inscription: "May Ahura Mazda protect this kingdom which I have built." Beneath those words, the light of the setting sun crossed the valley, glinting on the unfinished stones of Persepolis. The city he had dreamed of was still rising. It would outlive him. When Darius the Great died, the stones were still being lifted. The plans lay half-drawn, the terraces only partly filled. The air above the plain alive with the rhythm of chisels. His dream did not end with him. It had already taken on a life of its own. Persepolis, the city that was not meant for daily rule but for eternal ceremony, was becoming real. The new king, Xerxes, inherited not only the empire, but the blueprint of its soul. Yet the spirit of the work remained Darius's. Every block raised, every tablet signed, bore his formula. By the favor of Ahura Mazda, this I built. The laborers who continued the task may not have spoken his name aloud, but they worked within his logic. Order through creation, permanence through design. The site had been chosen with precision. At the foot of Ku'e Rahmat, the mountain of mercy, the ground spread wide and solid, open to the sun and the winds. Below it lay the plain of Marv dashed, watered by rivers and framed by mountains that shimmered blue in the distance. Here, far from the coastal humidity of Susa and the dust of Babylon, the king envisioned a sanctuary of stone, a place where the empire could gather itself and stand visible beneath heaven. To make a level surface for his vision, engineers filled the uneven ground with nearly 2 million cubic meters of earth and rock, forming a platform 14 meters high and larger than 100 city blocks. It was a foundation as symbolic as it was practical. Beneath its surface ran drains and channels carved with the same care as the palaces above, designed to guide water safely through centuries. The architects planned for time itself to pass without erosion. From this base rose stairways wide enough for processions, their steps shallow so that ambassadors could ascend in calm, unbroken movement. Nothing about Persepolis was hurried. It was meant to impress not with height, but with harmony. Those who climbed would rise not to the king alone, but into an idea. The workforce that built it came from every horizon. The Persepolis fortification tablets, buried for millennia and later found in the ruins, record their names. Stonemasons from Sardis, brickmakers from Babylon, woodcutters from Carmania, artisans from Egypt and Bactria. They were not slaves. Each received rations of grain, wine, and oil, carefully measured and sealed with official marks. Some even traveled with families. The tablets note women, administrators, foremen, accountants, proof that the empire's daily life was not ruled by chains, but by contracts. The stone itself came from the flanks of Ku'e Rahmat. Enormous blocks, some weighing more than 60 tons, were cut directly from the mountain and dragged to the site on sledges greased with oil. Teams of oxen and men moved them in rhythm, guided by shouted chants. At each placement, wooden beams were inserted between stones, a simple technique that would let the structure breathe during earthquakes. Even in that, the builders planned for endurance. It was during these years that the Apadana, the grand audience hall, began to rise. Its columns, 20 meters high, were shaped from single shafts of limestone and topped with double-headed bulls whose serene faces looked outward over the plain. When light struck their horns at dawn, the stone seemed to glow. Beneath that canopy of beasts and light, the empire would perform its most sacred ritual, the presentation of tribute during the New Year festival, when nations came to renew their loyalty. On the stairways of the Apadana, sculptors carved the procession that still defines Persepolis today. One by one, 23 subject peoples advanced toward the throne. Lydians bearing golden bowls, Egyptians carrying ivory tusks, Indians bringing gold dust in baskets of woven reeds, Bactrians leading a camel, Ethiopians with elephant ivory and okapi hides. Each delegation is distinct, different clothing, hairstyles, and gifts, but they move in perfect rhythm, heads held high, not bowed. This was no triumphal parade. It was harmony made visible. The message was deliberate. In Darius's vision, diversity was not disorder. Every land, every tongue, had a place within the circle of order, Kshatra, the divine dominion. To appear on those walls was to be part of the world's balance. Behind the ceremony lay the relentless order of the scribes. Clay documents tracked everything, from rations to travel permissions. A carpenter journeying from Susa to Persepolis received a tablet authorizing his provisions along the way. The empire's roads, the same ones Darius had built, fed the construction site like arteries. What appeared to be chaos, languages, faces, crafts, was in truth a single breathing organism. As years passed, Persepolis began to develop its distinct rhythm. At sunrise, the mountain threw its shadow across the terrace. By noon, the light fell full upon the walls, tracing every carved robe and hand with fire. The air filled with the clang of chisels, the calls of overseers, the creak of pulleys. By evening, smoke rose from kitchens feeding thousands. What was once a plain had become a hive, a city not for living, but for becoming. Even in its unfinished state, the design revealed a subtle geometry. The palaces were arranged not by convenience, but by ceremony. Each doorway aligned with another, each hall framed by views of terraces or distant hills. The Gate of All Nations, later completed under Xerxes, marked the entrance where envoys would dismount and begin their formal approach. Beyond it lay the throne hall, its pillars carved with lions overpowering bulls, the eternal struggle of light against darkness, order against chaos. That motif repeated everywhere, in reliefs, in painted tiles, even in the rhythm of the steps. The symbolism was never merely decoration, it was language. The empire spoke in stone, declaring that power rested on the triumph of harmony over conflict. As decades went on, craftsmen left their marks on hidden surfaces, names scratched in Elamite, Aramaic, Greek. They did not expect to be remembered. Yet through them, the city gained a quiet intimacy. Beneath its grandeur lay the fingerprints of thousands. Persepolis was not the work of one ruler's vanity, but of collective precision, a communion of effort across generations. When Xerxes finally stood upon the completed terrace and looked out across the plain, the empire reflected itself back to him. Behind him, reliefs of his father. Before him, the nations assembled in orderly ascent. In that moment, Persepolis became more than architecture. It became ritual embodied. The king did not merely receive tribute there. He enacted creation, the renewal of cosmic order under the gaze of Ahura Mazda. Still, no structure is ever complete. Even as the halls reached perfection, the edges remained restless. Some reliefs were left half-carved, their outlines still visible, as though waiting for a future that never arrived. Scholars would later debate why. Perhaps the artisans were reassigned, perhaps rituals changed, perhaps the king lost interest. But in their unfinished state, those blank panels lend the city a strange vitality, as if it still listens for the next command. By the time the last scaffolds came down, Persepolis had already outlived its maker's intent. It was not just a monument, but a mirror of the empire's confidence, a place built to convince even time itself that Persia would not fade. And yet, beneath its brilliance, cracks were forming. The unity that Darius had engineered would hold for another generation, maybe two, before ambition and war tested its limits. For now, the city stood flawless. The lions faced the bulls. The nations climbed in eternal procession. The terraces caught the sun as they were meant to. The dream carved into the mountain had become the empire's face. By the time the scaffolds were gone, Persepolis no longer looked like a construction site. It looked like a revelation. From the terrace, the land unfurled in every direction. Mountains behind, rivers winding across the plain below, and above it all, the polished stone of a city that seemed to have stepped out of the imagination of gods. It was neither fortress nor dwelling. It was theatre, altar, statement. The first sight a traveller met was the gate of all nations. Two colossal guardians flanked its entrance, human-headed bulls whose hooves rested on polished slabs. Their faces were calm, not ferocious, as if they understood that true power did not need to roar. Through them lay a broad court paved with limestone blocks, worn smooth even in their own time by the procession of envoys who came each year to renew their allegiance. Every step toward the heart of Persepolis carried a message. The staircases were shallow, built for dignity rather than speed, so that a delegation's ascent became a ritual in itself. The stone beneath one's feet still holds the chisel marks, faint but deliberate, as if the builders wanted even the smallest surface to speak of craft. When sunlight slid across the walls, the reliefs came alive. The folds of robes, the braids in hair, the quiet determination of faces carved in a language older than writing. At the center of this world stood the Apadana, the great audience hall. Its foundations were laid by Darius the Great, but the final polish belonged to his son Xerxes, who raised the last columns and sealed the ceiling with cedar beams from Lebanon. The hall was vast, 70 meters square, high enough that the echoes of footsteps vanished into the rafters. 60 columns held the roof, each crowned with twin capitals, bulls, lions, griffins, creatures forever supporting the weight of heaven. They stared outward, guardians of harmony. When the doors opened during festival days, the sight must have silenced every visitor. Floors of dark stone caught the light from bronze lamps. Walls once painted in deep blues and ochres glimmered with scenes of kings and courtiers. In the center stood a golden throne upon a stepped platform, its legs shaped like lion paws, its back engraved with the winged symbol of Ahura Mazda. Behind it, open balconies framed the mountains, nature itself drafted into the ceremony of rule. The Apadana foundation tablets, discovered centuries later, reveal what Darius intended this hall to signify. On small slabs of gold and silver, buried beneath the corners of the building, he had written the same message in 3 languages. By the favor of Ahura Mazda, this palace I built. May it be protected from harm. The repetition was deliberate. To speak those words in Elamite, Babylonian, and Old Persian was to remind every tongue of its place within the empire's harmony. Around the walls, carved in unending sequence, moved the procession of nations. 23 delegations, each distinct yet unified by the rhythm of the composition. The Lydians brought bowls and necklaces of gold. Indians, baskets filled with dust from their rivers. Babylonians, folded garments and vases. Ethiopians, ivory and exotic animals. Arabs, a dromedary. Bactrians, their shaggy camels. None were shown as captives. They came willingly, gifts held high, faces composed, walking in quiet order toward the king, who sat waiting at the far end of the hall. Every motion carved into that stone was measured. The sculptors were not recording a literal ceremony. They were composing an argument. That empire was peace, that difference could exist without discord, that the world itself converged here and found balance beneath Persian authority. The reliefs did not shout victory, they whispered endurance. Beyond the Apadana lay the throne hall, sometimes called the Hall of 100 Columns. Larger still, it was supported by a forest of pillars, each one carved with fluted shafts and capitals shaped like lions in confrontation. When torches burned at night, their shadows crossed the floor like the stripes of a giant predator moving through moonlight. This was the heart of imperial ritual, where Xerxes and his successors received satraps and generals, judged petitions, and issued decrees sealed with the royal signet. Unlike the Apadana, which opened to the terraces and sunlight, the throne hall was inward, enclosed. Its acoustics were so precise that a single voice at the dais could reach the farthest column without strain. The architects had turned stone into instrument. Even in silence, the space resonated with authority. To walk through these halls was to enter an argument about order and time. Every surface, every corridor reinforced the idea that power did not destroy, it arranged. The architecture itself seemed to breathe in rhythm with cosmic law. Light entering, shadows retreating, symmetry everywhere. The Persians had created a language in limestone that spoke of patience, not conquest. Behind the ceremonial buildings stretched the administrative core, storerooms, archives, and the vast treasury where workers tallied gold and silver, and scribes pressed the day's records into wet clay. The Persepolis fortification tablets, now scattered across museums, came from these rooms. They mention carpenters, guards, herders, cooks. They describe rations distributed by women of rank. They record wine deliveries for festivals. Reading them, one senses a world that functioned with the precision of a heart, pulsing, constant, alive beneath the glitter of ceremony. Each corridor led back to the same principle, the union of grandeur and order. From the terraces, couriers could be seen arriving from distant satrapies. They brought tokens and letters, petitions wrapped in cloth, news of the frontiers. Persepolis was never meant to rule the empire. It was meant to confirm it. It existed to remind every subject, from the Indus farmer to the Ionian merchant, that the center held firm. On festival days, the terraces would fill with color and sound. Trumpets from Susa, drums from Lydia, chants from priests of Ahura Mazda. At sunrise, the king appeared, wearing a robe patterned in gold thread, flanked by guards in scaled armor. As he ascended the steps of the Apadana, the reliefs around him came alive. The sculpted nations seemed to move in rhythm with the real ones gathering below. To witness that convergence must have felt like watching myth step into daylight. For all its precision, Persepolis was not sterile. Gardens surrounded the terraces, watered by hidden channels that brought life to the arid ground. Cypress and palm grew beside imported lilies. Peacocks wandered the courtyards. The air smelled of cedar and incense. Even the smallest detail, the curvature of a stair rail, the alignment of a shadow, spoke of intention. The city was a living calendar, tuned to the seasons, to the movement of sun and stars. Over time, the complex grew beyond Darius's original plan. Xerxes added his own palace, the harem complex, and new gates for ceremonial processions. Artaxerxes later would expand the gardens, yet each addition followed the same geometry, as though every king knew he was contributing to a single composition already written. Centuries would pass before foreign eyes looked upon these stones again. But in the height of the Achaemenid age, Persepolis stood at the center of a world that believed itself eternal. The empire stretched from Libya to the Indus, from the Oxus to the Aegean, and yet all its distances seemed to converge here, in halls where no weapon was drawn, where the weight of empire was carried by stone bulls and human ceremony. As the sun sank behind Kuhe Rahmat, the limestone burned gold, then crimson, then disappeared into shadow. Columns became silhouettes, the reliefs dissolved into outline. The last rays touched the high terraces and faded. The halls stood empty but unbroken, waiting for the next dawn when the procession would begin again, forever climbing, forever bearing tribute, forever preserved in the stillness of stone. At dawn, Persepolis changed character. The light moved across its terraces like a benediction, catching the wings of carved creatures and the polished horns of bulls, sliding along walls that seemed to breathe. To an envoy arriving from the far reaches of the empire, this was not merely a palace. It was revelation made of stone. The city spoke in silence, and every surface carried a message. Nothing at Persepolis existed for decoration alone. The reliefs, the columns, the endless repetition of lions and bulls, all belonged to a system of symbols through which the Persians expressed their understanding of order and the world's balance. The lion devouring the bull, carved again and again across doorways and thresholds, was more than art. It was the eternal rhythm of creation and renewal, the triumph of light over darkness, spring over winter, day over night. It mirrored the cycles of the year, the ceaseless victory of life over decline. When the lion sank its teeth into the bull's flank, it was not violence. It was harmony, disguised as struggle. Inside the great halls, other patterns told the same truth. Palm trees and lotus flowers, sculpted or painted, repeated across capitals and friezes. Each motif came from a different land. The palm from Mesopotamia, the lotus from Egypt. But together, they formed a universal language of prosperity. Darius's architects had translated diversity into ornament, showing that every culture the empire contained could find its echo here. During the sacred Nowruz festival, when the new year began at the spring equinox, Persepolis came fully alive. The tablets found in its archives mention increased wine rations, distributions of grain, and feasts that lasted for days. Delegations from across the empire gathered at the foot of the terrace, waiting to ascend the stairways that led to the Apadana. Trumpets sounded from the courtyard. Incense rose from braziers. The air smelled of myrrh and warm bread. The king, dressed in embroidered robes, appeared beneath the carved bulls of the colonnade, surrounded by priests and nobles. It was not a spectacle of conquest, but of renewal. Each Nowruz, the empire reaffirmed itself as part of the divine order. Asha, the truth that sustains all creation. The king was not worshipped as a god, but served as the mediator between mankind and the wise lord, Ahura Mazda. To him and through him, the empire offered gratitude for the passing of darkness and the return of light. The ritual processions reflected this belief. The envoys did not kneel or prostrate themselves. They stepped forward, gifts held high, their expressions calm and dignified. In that gesture lay the essence of Achaemenid ideology: obedience without humiliation, hierarchy without degradation. The king's authority was absolute, yet his subjects were portrayed as willing participants in the order of the world. It was propaganda refined to theology. From the Persepolis fortification tablets, archaeologists later learned that even religion at Persepolis was multifaceted. Offerings were made not only to Ahura Mazda, but also to Mithra, guardian of covenants, to Anahita, the goddess of waters and fertility, and to older Elamite deities whose names had not yet faded. The empire's faith was not uniform, but inclusive, a pantheon of local devotions unified by the idea that truth and creation were one. Within the so-called harem inscriptions, Xerxes himself described his divine appointment. By the favor of Ahura Mazda, I am king. The god has granted me the kingdom. For him, as for his father, power was sacred trust. The city's layout reflected that conviction. The temples and palaces aligned with the sun's course. Processional routes followed astronomical logic. The whole of Persepolis was, in a sense, a cosmic calendar, stone acting out the rhythm of heaven. To the common people who labored in its kitchens and storehouses, these meanings may have been remote, yet the rituals touched them too. The records mention land ceremonies, occasions when provisions were distributed to all ranks: bread, meat, wine. During festival days, rations increased fivefold. For a few nights each year, even the humblest worker shared in the abundance of empire. This too was part of its design, a moment when hierarchy softened and the entire realm participated in divine renewal. Among the most curious features of Persepolis are the unfinished reliefs, blank panels where outlines remain, but the chisels never cut deeper. No one knows why they were left incomplete. Perhaps the ceremony they depicted changed. Perhaps the artisans were called away. But their presence lends the city an air of living expectation, as though the story it tells is still being written. The empire's confidence was immense, yet even here, uncertainty left its mark. Fire altars appear rarely in the reliefs, an omission that puzzled later scholars. In a world that revered sacred flame, why leave it absent from the imagery of the heart of the empire? Perhaps because Persepolis itself was the altar, the meeting place of light and order. The sun's path over the terrace, the reflections of stone at noon, the alignment of columns, all were acts of devotion performed by architecture. Worship had become environment. Everywhere, symbols of harmony multiplied, columns paired in symmetry, lions mirrored by bulls, humans framed by guardians. Even the king's relief, carved above the throne hall, where the monarch raises his hand toward Ahura Mazda, speaks less of domination than of dialogue. The god extends his own gesture in return, a silent covenant. In that moment, man and divinity meet halfway, bound by mutual recognition. Persepolis thus embodied more than imperial power. It expressed a worldview in which creation itself was order, and art its most sacred expression. To carve a figure correctly was to participate in truth. To build a column upright was to resist chaos. Every mason, every scribe, contributed to the maintenance of Asher. The city was not only for kings, it was a cosmic mechanism to keep the world aligned. When night fell, the sacred geometry transformed again. Torches flickered against the reliefs. The bulls above the gates glowed like living sentinels, and from the terraces below came the hum of songs in a dozen languages. Priests chanted in Old Persian, merchants toasted in Aramaic. Egyptian guards spoke softly of the Nile. In that mingling of tongues, the empire's true miracle was revealed. Not conquest, but coexistence. And then, as the festival waned, silence would return. The fires dimmed, the gates closed, and the terrace cooled under the stars. The king withdrew to his private quarters, and Persepolis, emptied of its crowds, stood like a living being at rest, its walls breathing, its symbols still working in the dark. In the hush that followed celebration, one could almost hear the rhythm that sustained it all, the heartbeat of empire, measured, certain, believing itself eternal. The silence that followed Darius's death was not grief, it was expectation. The empire waited for the next heartbeat, and when it came, it sounded like the strike of a drum. Xerxes, son of Darius, entered the world stage already burdened by its symmetry. He had grown up among the terraces of Persepolis, where the air rang with chisels and the scent of cedar mixed with stone dust. For him, empire was not achievement. It was inheritance as inevitable as sunrise. From the first day of his rule, he moved with deliberate confidence. The court saw in him a man who measured greatness, not by peace, but by continuation. He walked the same halls his father had built, yet found in them both comfort and challenge. The foundations were flawless. The question was how to expand them without diminishing their maker. Xerxes began by inscribing his name across new works at Persepolis, He ordered the Gate of All Nations, the Hall of 100 Columns, and fresh embellishments to the royal apartments. Where Darius had spoken the language of harmony, Xerxes wrote in the idiom of dominance. His inscriptions still began with the invocation of Ahura Mazda, but the tone was less petition than proclamation. By the favor of the wise Lord, I am Xerxes, the great king. The phrase sounded like stone declaring itself eternal. Beyond the terraces, trouble brewed. In Babylon, old pride smoldered once more. The city that had embraced Cyrus now resented distant oversight. A rebel calling himself Belshimani claimed the throne, and Babylon rose behind its ancient walls. Xerxes answered without hesitation. The campaign was swift, merciless, and final. Temples were stripped of their wealth, privileges revoked, and the golden statue of Marduk, the god Cyrus had once restored, was removed from his shrine. To the Babylonians, it was sacrilege. To Xerxes, purification. His diver inscription, carved later in Persepolis, justifies the act. He declares that he destroyed the sanctuaries of false gods and exalted Ahura Mazda as the only true source of kingship. In that fusion of faith and policy lay the essence of his reign: obedience as worship, rebellion as blasphemy. The architecture of empire became a theology in motion. But piety soon gave way to ambition. To the west, the memory of Marathon lingered like an insult carved into bronze. Xerxes saw in Greece not a handful of rebellious cities, but a flaw in the world's design. If Ahura Mazda had chosen Persia to uphold order, then these Greeks, defiant, divided, and reckless, were the agents of chaos. He would correct them. Preparations began on a scale that stunned even his generals. Shipwrights in Phoenicia built galleys by the hundreds. Engineers bridged the Hellespont with chains of anchored ships. A canal was carved through the Athos Peninsula to save his fleet from the storms that had wrecked Darius's. Roads were resurfaced, granaries filled, forges roared night and day. From every satrapy came men and animals, languages and banners, Medes, Indians, Egyptians, Bactrians, Scythians. An empire transformed into motion. Herodotus would later claim that the host drank rivers dry. Exaggeration, perhaps, but the image fits. The Persian army was less an army than a moving horizon. At its center, Xerxes rode in a chariot plated with gold, the royal guard marching around him in mirrored armor, their spears glittering like sunbeams made solid. To those who saw the column pass, it must have looked as if the world itself were migrating. The campaign opened with thunder and prophecy. It ended in smoke. At Thermopylae, victory came at a price measured in days, not destiny. At Salamis, the sea turned traitor. From a hill above the straits, Xerxes watched his fleet dissolve beneath Athenian rams and Corinthian fire. The water boiled with splintered wood and shouting men. The sky above darkened with smoke that no prayer could dispel. When he returned to Asia, the great king brought no captives, no trophies, only silence. The empire still stretched from the Nile to the Indus, its wealth untouched, its bureaucracy humming. But the illusion of invincibility had cracked. The gods had not withdrawn their favor. They had reminded him of proportion. He turned back to Persepolis, perhaps seeking refuge in stone. Construction resumed with renewed fervor. The Gate of All Nations took form. 2 colossal bulls at its entrance, their faces impassive, their bodies carved with patience. Each block bore the mason's mark, each corner measured to perfection. On its walls, Xerxes left his warning: "May Ahura Mazda protect this work from those who would deface it." It was not merely piety, it was defiance. The man who had seen the Aegean swallow his fleet now sought to anchor his name in rock. Within the treasury, scribes kept the rhythm of empire. The tablets from these years list payments to artisans, compensations for deaths, rations of wine and barley. The empire functioned like a machine that refused to acknowledge defeat. A builder crushed by a falling stone would have his family compensated in grain. A courier killed on the road would be replaced before sunset. Even mortality was entered into the ledger, measured and resolved. Yet victory on parchment could not erase failure at sea. Poets at court began to speak of fate, of the wheel that raises and lowers kings. Xerxes' decrees grew longer, his inscriptions more fervent, as if faith could outshout uncertainty. Beneath the marble calm of Persepolis, doubt took root. He spent more time within the private palaces, the complex later misnamed the harem, where walls were painted in blue and ochre and corridors muffled sound. Here, scribes copied royal correspondence. Ministers debated grain levies and revolts. It was administrative rather than sensual space. Yet stories later whispered that this was where the king met his end. Some claimed assassination by a courtier named Artaxerxes, others a plot involving his sons. The truth remains buried beneath layers of plaster, but the architecture records the interruption. Rooms abruptly sealed, corridors unfinished, a design halted mid-gesture, Persepolis marking in stone what the chronicles leave vague. After his death, the empire endured through habit. Governors still sent tribute, inspectors still rode the royal roads. The system his father had built was too intricate to fail overnight. But the tone changed. The moral certainty that had once wrapped Persian rule began to loosen. Kings would still speak of Ahura Mazda, but less as partner, more as justification. Power remained absolute, faith administrative. Even so, Persepolis flourished. The terraces gleamed under the sun. The bulls guarded the gates. The reliefs of the nations marched forever upward in frozen obedience. To the artisans who maintained them, the empire still seemed eternal. They could not hear the distant echo of ships breaking in the Aegean, or sense that the perfection surrounding them was already a monument to fragility. Centuries later, conquerors from the West would enter these same gates, marvel at their precision and misunderstand their purpose. But that belongs to another story. In Xerxes' day, the empire still glittered beneath its crown of fire, brilliant, unbroken, and unaware of the fissures spreading quietly beneath its foundations. After Xerxes was gone, Persepolis remained exactly as he had left it, serene, immense, and curiously self-possessed. The bulls at the gates still faced east, the lions still held the bulls in their frozen grip, and the carved nations continued their endless climb toward the throne. The empire had lost its voice, yet the city kept speaking in stone. Ruling from those terraces now fell to his successors, but the machinery of the realm barely paused. Couriers still thundered down the royal road. Scribes still pressed symbols into clay. The priests still measured prayers by the sun. To live in Persepolis during those years was to inhabit rhythm rather than change. The pulse of the empire had outlasted its kings. From the lower plain, approaching envoys saw the same spectacle their ancestors had seen under Darius and Xerxes. Stairways gleaming in light, reliefs alive with nations, and guards in polished armor, motionless as statues. Yet within the gates, the atmosphere had softened. The empire was older now, less exultant in its perfection, more careful in its continuance. Power had become tradition, and tradition its own kind of rule. Inside the walls, life unfolded with precision, bordering on ritual. Messengers arrived from every province. Armenian riders with snow still clinging to their cloaks, Bactrian couriers smelling of camel dust, Greek interpreters wrapped in wool. Their reports filled the archives. Tallies of grain, shipments of lapis, complaints from distant satraps. The fortification tablets recorded it all, an ocean of order pressed into clay. Among the names appear women who managed estates and oversaw laborers. The most prominent was Erdabama, a noble administrator whose seal carried the emblem of a flower in bloom. Her accounts mention thousands of workers across fields, vineyards, and textile houses. She assigned wages in silver, grain, or wine. She appointed overseers, approved festivals, and corresponded directly with the royal treasurer. Through her, one glimpses an empire where authority could wear more than one face. Every occupation had its measure. Masons and carpenters earned fixed rations of barley. Singers received wine for holy days. Guards were issued oil for lamps and sandals for long watch shifts. The bureaucracy turned generosity into mathematics. In a kingdom of so many tongues, numbers were the only universal speech. In the great treasury, scribes worked among gold dust and perfume jars, cataloguing tribute that came from across the known world. Babylon sent woven linen. Egypt sent ivory. India sent precious woods and spices. Even the distant satrapies along the Oxus Valley contributed. Horses, turquoise, mountain wool. The halls smelled of beeswax, cedar, and ink. Each package was weighed, recorded, sealed with a cylinder engraved with the king's name. The courtyards beyond the offices were less formal. Traders lingered with their beasts. Soldiers swapped stories in half a dozen languages. Musicians rehearsed beneath shaded colonnades. The empire's diversity was most visible in these pauses, in the laughter of men who might have once faced each other across battlefields. At Persepolis, conflict became coexistence. When festivals approached, the city changed tempo. Preparations for Nowruz, the new year, began weeks ahead. Bakers ground extra flour. Wine presses worked without rest. Artisans polished gifts intended for royal ceremonies. The terraces, normally austere, turned theatrical. Banners fluttering, incense burning, bronze lamps gleaming against the dusk. Envoys assembled at the base of the stairways, their garments bright with embroidery and dust from travel. Each knew his place in the procession, rehearsed until movement itself became a form of worship. At sunrise, trumpets sounded from the upper platform. Priests intoned hymns to Ahura Mazda, invoking light to cleanse the old year. Then the delegations began their ascent. Lydians with golden bowls, Ethiopians with ivory tusks, Indians carrying baskets of gold dust, Arabs leading camels, Bactrians bringing wool and horses. They climbed in silence, flanked by guards whose armor caught the morning sun. The living mirrored the carvings beside them. At the summit waited the king, seated beneath a canopy, supported by sculpted griffins. The audience was formal, yet strangely humane. No one prostrated, no chains clinked. Each envoy offered his gift, spoke his words of loyalty through an interpreter, and stepped aside. The order of nations was reaffirmed not by conquest, but by ceremony. The reliefs on the walls were prophecy made perpetual. Beyond the rituals, court life had its quieter rhythms. In the evenings, the gardens below the terraces filled with voices, courtiers strolling beneath cypress and palm, children chasing fireflies between the irrigation channels. The empire's architects had learned to shape not only stone, but water. Hidden conduits cooled the courtyards and kept the lilies blooming even in heat. From the kitchens drifted the smell of honey cakes and roasted lamb. Somewhere, musicians tuned lyres to ancient modes. Inside the royal quarters, clerks tallied the day's reports. Some nights, the king himself, whether Xerxes' heir or a later descendant, would walk the colonnades alone, listening to the wind slide through the pillars. The reliefs around him seemed alive in torchlight, the carved faces shifting as the flames moved. It was said that the bulls guarding the gate of all nations glowed faintly at dusk, as if the sun had left a fragment of itself behind. Bureaucracy never slept. Even as musicians played, scribes counted. Even as guards changed watch, messengers departed. Persepolis functioned like a body in perfect health, heart steady, breath measured, mind absorbed in its own perpetuation. Yet perfection carries its own weariness. Among the younger courtiers, whispers began to surface of satraps growing independent, of armies idle too long, of taxes tightened in distant provinces. The empire still looked invincible, but those who lived inside its symmetry could sense the strain. The same rituals that once embodied vitality now felt like repetition. Still, mornings came with the same precision. The terraces lit one by one. The gates opened, officials assembled. The empire breathed again, certain that routine was immortality. When foreign envoys described Persepolis in their letters, they spoke not of kings or policies, but of its serenity, a place where nothing seemed able to change. For the artisans and scribes, that illusion was enough. They lived, married, raised children in the shadow of pillars taller than memory. They believed the empire's stone heart would outlast all of them, and perhaps, in a way, it has. The tablets they pressed, the carvings they finished, the stair they polished with daily use, all still whisper across the centuries. In the stillness of those terraces, the hum of administration and ceremony blurred into one unending act of affirmation. Persepolis was more than a capital. It was the empire's pulse made visible. Every gesture repeated the same truth. That order was sacred, and that to maintain it was to keep the world alive. For all its splendor, Persepolis had begun to echo. The courtyards still filled with light, the ceremonies still moved in practiced order, but something beneath the marble calm had shifted. The empire was still whole, yet it no longer breathed with the same confidence. The rhythm of governance continued, rations counted, taxes sealed, reports dispatched. But the faith that once bound these acts together had grown thin. What had been harmony under Darius and conviction under Xerxes was turning into habit. The kings who followed inherited the machinery, but not the certainty. They still invoked Ahura Mazda, but their prayers sounded more administrative than divine. From Susa to Sardis, governors acted with increasing independence, interpreting royal decrees as suggestions rather than commands. The empire, once united by purpose, was learning to function through inertia. Within the walls of Persepolis, that change was almost invisible. The terraces gleamed, the bulls stood firm, the scribes kept writing. But those who lived close to the throne could feel the tension building, a weight pressing through the silence between ceremonies. There were too many hands on the levers of power, and none strong enough to hold them all steady. When Artaxerxes I ascended the throne, the scars of earlier conspiracies still lingered. His father, Xerxes, had been murdered inside his own palace. Whether by a trusted courtier or his own son remained uncertain. The story was whispered but never written, a wound covered by ceremony. Artaxerxes ruled cautiously, balancing the rival factions that had once turned against each other in the shadowed halls of the harem. The architecture itself seemed to remember. Some chambers ended abruptly, where walls had been sealed. Corridors twisted without reason. Inscriptions broke off mid-line. What looked like design was really interruption. Persepolis, perfect on the outside, carried the scars of its own betrayals. Beyond its terraces, unrest flickered like sparks beneath a heavy lid. In Egypt, resentment toward Persian rule flared again. The satrap Achaemenids, a royal relative, held the province with brutal efficiency until an Egyptian revolt ended his life. Though the rebellion was crushed, the message was clear. Obedience had limits. Farther east, Elam, the old land whose language filled the fortification tablets, rose in brief defiance. Even Babylon, weary but unbroken, murmured of freedom. The administrative records from these decades grow uneven. Gaps appear in the archives. Payments delayed, ration lists incomplete. Archaeologists later found layers of ash in the treasury's upper levels, traces of fire that had nothing to do with conquest. Perhaps an accident, perhaps not. When power falters, even negligence can ignite ruin. Those who served in Persepolis learned to read danger, not from proclamations, but from silences. A cancelled audience, a sealed door, a new guard rotation, these were omens. The palace thrived on ritual, and every deviation carried meaning. Among the courtiers, rivalries multiplied. Some sought favor through devotion, others through cunning. The satraps of distant provinces, entrusted with both military and civil power, began to act as kings in miniature. They built estates, commanded armies, and ruled as if the royal court existed only to confirm what they had already decided. Tribute still arrived, but slower, sometimes lighter than expected. The heart of empire still beat, but its pulse had weakened. Meanwhile, the artisans continued their work as though nothing had changed. They repaired carvings, replaced weathered bricks, maintained the drainage channels that kept the terrace dry through the winter rains. The workers' tablets mentioned new supervisors, new names, evidence of continuity or perhaps of turnover caused by turmoil. To the men who swung hammers, politics was noise from above. What mattered was the stone before them. And yet, even they must have noticed the air had grown heavier. The court poets sensed it too. Their verses turned somber, praising not conquest or divine favor, but endurance itself. They wrote of time eroding memory, of empires preserved only by their stories. In that melancholy tone, one hears the first echo of decline, the awareness that even eternity needs maintenance. When Artaxerxes died, succession came uneasily. His sons quarreled, and blood was spilled within the very halls meant to symbolize order. For days, the palace stood still, its doors shut, its guards silent. No smoke rose from the kitchens. When the crisis passed and a new king was proclaimed, no announcement was carved into stone. The scribes had learned restraint. Not every victory deserved permanence. The treasury, once the empire's pulse, showed signs of disturbance. Reliefs were damaged in places where fire had scorched the limestone. Later restorations disguised the wounds, but not entirely. Beneath a layer of plaster, archaeologists found blackened stone, the residue of a blaze fierce enough to crack walls. The event left no inscription, only traces, a reminder that even the empire's most ordered space could host chaos. And yet, Persepolis endured. The bulls remained at their posts. The stairways still echoed with the steps of envoys. The terraces still held the sun. The empire's strength lay in its repetition, the stubborn belief that continuity was victory. Even rebellion, when suppressed, became another proof of control. The Persians were masters of adaptation. Each crisis transformed into procedure, each fracture smoothed with ceremony. But under that calm surface, a new kind of wear crept in. The empire had grown too large, too dependent on its own reputation. Where Darius had once built unity through communication, later kings ruled through distance. Their faces appeared on coins, their names on decrees, but their voices no longer reached the provinces. Authority had become image. Inside Persepolis, luxury deepened even as certainty thinned. Banquets multiplied, garments glittered with imported dyes. The court's appetite grew elaborate, the terraces filled with dancers and musicians during every festival. The ceremonies still invoked the ancient formulas, but few remembered their meanings. The priests chanted to keep rhythm, not faith. It was an age both magnificent and fragile. The empire's edges held, but its core had begun to hum with fatigue. When the wind swept through the gate of all nations, it carried a faint echo, stone meeting air, like breath drawn between words. Persepolis was listening to itself, unsure of what it had become. No chronicler recorded these subtleties, but the evidence remains in the stones. Some carvings were recut, older names replaced with newer ones, columns repaired with mismatched fragments. Even the drainage system, once flawless, shows later additions of rougher work. The city's perfection was being patched by practicality. Still, to the outside world, Persia appeared unassailable. Traders crossed its roads in safety. Foreign kings sent ambassadors draped in gifts. The spectacle endured because it had always endured. Persepolis stood as proof that time itself could be commanded, an illusion too grand to die easily. Night after night, the palace lights flickered against the mountains. From a distance, the glow seemed eternal, like a constellation fallen to earth. Up close, the oil burned low, and the wicks needed trimming. The empire was still alight, but every flame requires tending. By the 4th century before Christ, the empire had learned how to survive itself. After decades of conspiracies and sudden deaths, Artaxerxes II inherited a realm that was scarred, but still magnificent. To his courtiers, he appeared less a conqueror than a caretaker, a man born into too much history. Yet he reigned for more than 40 years, the longest of all the Achaemenid kings, and in that endurance he restored something close to faith. When he first appeared on the terraces of Persepolis, the crowd studied his face for signs of his father's temperament. They found instead a quieter authority. His gestures were deliberate, his words careful, his policies patient. He seemed to believe that if he simply kept the empire breathing, the gods would forgive its earlier violence. Across the mountains, new threats gathered. The Greek mercenaries returning from their eastern adventures, rebellious satraps swollen with local power, the restless kingdom of Sparta testing the western borders. Yet Artaxerxes did not answer them with reckless war. He preferred negotiation, bribery, and the slow erosion of his enemy's will. The empire's armies still marched, but more often their victories were bought rather than fought. Gold now served where iron once had. Persepolis reflected this tempered grandeur. Construction resumed, not to expand, but to refine. The palace of Artaxerxes II rose beside the older halls, smaller in scale but intricate in ornament. Its columns had slimmer shafts, its capitals softened with floral motifs, rather than bulls or lions. The new king favored elegance over awe. On foundation plaques written in 3 languages, he invoked Ahura Mazda, Mithra, and Anahita together, a subtle shift from the stern monotheism of his ancestors toward a broader, more inclusive faith. That blending of gods mirrored the empire's own need to reconcile its many souls. From Egypt to Bactria, the old provinces still obeyed, but obedience had become weary. Artaxerxes answered not with decrees, but with symbols. He restored shrines, sponsored festivals, and commissioned reliefs showing harmony instead of conquest. The imagery of victory gave way to scenes of offering, flowers instead of swords, open hands instead of chains. In the palace gardens, the Paradisa, whose name would become paradise in other tongues, artisans built terraces, watered by channels so precise that each tree cast its reflection in perfect stillness. Cypress, pomegranate, and imported date palms stood beside marble benches. The irrigation system drew water from mountain springs, carried through clay pipes that breathed faintly in the heat. Foreign envoys walked those paths in astonishment. Nowhere else in the world did nature appear so obedient. At night, musicians played in the courtyards, their melodies mingling Persian rhythm with Greek lyre and Egyptian flute. The empire no longer demanded uniformity. It displayed variety as proof of control. To rule so many peoples was to orchestrate difference. In this, Artaxerxes excelled. The Atu-Pa inscription, discovered centuries later, captures his temperament. By the grace of Ahura Mazda, Anahita, and Mithra, I built this palace. May it stand firm. May the gods protect my works. The triad of divine names was deliberate. It proclaimed that piety, like power, could adapt. Yet even adaptability has its price. To maintain harmony, Artaxerxes bought peace at every frontier, subsidizing Spartan rivals, paying Greek generals, appeasing Egypt with treaties. Gold flowed outward faster than it returned. The treasury at Persepolis still glittered, but its ledgers told another story. Reserves slowly diminishing, silver stretched thin by diplomacy. The fortification archive, in its last surviving tablets, reflects that strain. The handwriting changes, rougher and rushed. Rations are smaller, units fewer. One entry notes a payment in copper instead of silver. An ominous economy of substitution. Beneath the calm veneer, inflation and fatigue whispered of decline. Still, for those who walked the terraces, none of this showed. The palaces gleamed as they always had. The columns of the Apadana caught the light. The reliefs of nations retained their poise. Visitors recorded banquets served on gold dishes, perfumes brought from Arabia, rugs woven in distant Sogdia. Even the courtiers began to believe again in eternity. The king himself aged with measured grace. Chroniclers described him as thoughtful, superstitious, prone to mercy. When his generals rebelled in the west, he forgave some and exiled others, preferring reconciliation over spectacle. Yet mercy could not erase ambition. The satraps' revolt, a confederation of governors seeking autonomy, erupted mid-reign. For 6 years, Persia fought itself. Battles flickered from the Aegean coast to Mesopotamia. Artaxerxes prevailed only through persistence and bribery, but the cost was legitimacy. Once an empire begins to purchase loyalty, it confesses weakness. In Persepolis, however, the illusions held. New artisans were brought to maintain the buildings. Painters retouched fading pigments. Stonemasons recarved weathered figures. Each repair was an act of defiance against time. The terraces became a museum of memory, maintained by those who still believed in form, if not in faith. Foreign observers noted the paradox. A ruler who commanded half the known world, yet feared the cracking of a column. One Greek visitor wrote that Artaxerxes saw omens in the wind. Perhaps he had reason. For every symbol of peace he erected, some distant province smoldered. Toward the end of his reign, the king devoted more attention to ritual than politics. Processions multiplied. Sacrifices grew elaborate. In the throne hall, where the reliefs showed the king supported by the peoples of the earth, priests now read prayers for the empire's endurance rather than its expansion. The ceremony of stability had replaced the ceremony of triumph, yet there were moments of brilliance. Under his rule, roads were repaired, irrigation revived, and trade with India and Arabia flourished. Persian art reached a new refinement: miniature carvings, delicate metalwork, and jewelry of astonishing subtlety. The empire had lost its hunger but gained polish. It glowed, if only briefly, with the calm of late afternoon light. When Artaxerxes finally died, he left behind not chaos, but exhaustion. The empire still stood, yet its energy had turned inward, its will consumed by the effort of remaining whole. His tomb, carved near those of Darius and Xerxes, shows him raising his hand toward the same winged symbol, surrounded by attendants carved with smaller, gentler features. There is no arrogance in that relief, only resignation, the wisdom of a man who knew that permanence is an argument against time, not a victory over it. After his death, artisans continued his projects for a few quiet years. The palace of Artaxerxes still smelled of fresh plaster. The gardens still ran with water. But soon the tablets stop. The records of Persepolis end abruptly, as if the scribes simply looked up one day and realized there was nothing left to record. Outside Persia, new powers were learning the languages of empire. To the west, Macedon stirred. To the north, restless tribes watched the borders. Inside the empire, the satraps regained confidence. The great machine, once self-sustaining, had begun to run on memory. And yet, standing on the terrace as dusk fell over the Marv-Dash plain, one could still believe in the illusion of endlessness. The columns caught the last fire of the sun, the carved nations shimmered as if moving, and the air smelled of dust and cedar. For that single hour, it seemed that Artaxerxes' dream had worked, that order could outlast ambition, and beauty could still disguise the wear of age. The sun still burned on the terraces of Persepolis, but its light had changed. It no longer gilded the empire. It revealed the cracks beneath the gold. Courtiers whispered that the stone itself seemed tired, that even the carved nations on the Apadana stairways had begun to lean with age. No empire collapses overnight. It first forgets why it stands. In the years after Artaxerxes II, that forgetting deepened. His heirs fought among themselves, and the line of kings wavered. Intrigue filled the palaces. Brothers poisoned brothers, courtiers plotted against ministers, and the crown passed through hands trembling with fear. When at last a new name appeared on the tablets, Darius III, it felt less like succession and more like exhaustion finding a form. He had not been destined for kingship. The chronicles describe him as capable, almost reluctant, a soldier rather than a dreamer, hardened by service but unprepared for the throne's loneliness. His coronation was quiet, surrounded by the scent of incense and the unspoken relief that someone, anyone, now ruled. Yet outside those halls, the world had already shifted. To the west, beyond the old satrapies and the sea, a young Macedonian king had begun to speak the language once reserved for Persia. Alexander, son of Philip, had inherited Greece and remade it. His generals marched with discipline. His ambitions reached beyond maps, and his gods promised him the same dominion once claimed by Cyrus. For the first time in centuries, Persia faced a rival who believed as absolutely as it once had. Darius's counselors dismissed the threat. They spoke of distance, of deserts and mountains, of the futility of Greek pride. Persia, they said, had crushed rebellions greater than this. Darius listened, but the confidence felt rehearsed. Reports from the Aegean carried a new tone. Macedonian garrisons replacing Persian ones, satraps losing their posts without battle. The tide was turning, and no one in Persepolis yet dared to call it a flood. The young conqueror crossed the Hellespont in the spring of 334 BC. His soldiers, numbering fewer than 40,000, moved as if led by certainty itself. At Granicus, the first Persian forces met them, local troops under provincial commanders. They were brave, ill-coordinated, and crushed within hours. The victory was small by scale, but vast in symbol. For the Greeks, it was vengeance. For Persia, a wound that reached the capital before the messengers did. Darius prepared to respond as his forefathers would have done, with scale. Orders were sent across the empire for men, horses, and provisions. Satraps raised their banners, temples offered prayers, and the royal artisans carved new inscriptions invoking Ahura Mazda's favor. Yet the unity that had once made Persia unstoppable had frayed. The armies gathered, but they gathered slowly, each province answering in its own time, each commander obeying with private reservations. The confrontation came at Issus, in the narrow lands between mountain and sea. Darius's host was immense, a shimmering labyrinth of armor and banners. He took his place at the center, high on a chariot of gold, surrounded by his household guard. The Macedonians advanced with silence and speed. The Persians fought as their ancestors had, honorably, expansively. But the age of maneuver had replaced the age of spectacle. The center broke. The royal chariot faltered. When the dust cleared, Darius was gone, his army scattered, his family captured. Persepolis received the news with disbelief. Courtiers wept, priests recited prayers of reversal, but the bureaucracy continued its rhythm. The fortification tablets from these years show no sign of panic, only a tightening of records, as if the scribes hoped that careful accounting might summon stability. The empire, even in crisis, refused to recognize disorder. Darius fled east to rebuild. The next year, he summoned new forces from every satrapy: Bactrian cavalry, Indian elephants, Sogdian archers. At Gaugamela, he faced Alexander again, this time on open ground of his own choosing. The plain was swept clean for his chariots, the horizon lined with men. By dawn, the air already shimmered with heat. When the battle began, it was less a clash than a dissection. Alexander drove straight for the center, breaking the command chain faster than messages could cross it. Once more the great king turned to flight, and with him went the last illusion of Persian invincibility. The empire's body still lived, but its mind had died. In Babylon, gates opened to the invaders without resistance. Susa followed, then Persepolis, still untouched, still radiant beneath its mountain. There, the scribes wrote their final entries. Brief, hurried, concerned with logistics. Wine for the guards, carts for provisions, storage of sealed goods. After that, silence. Somewhere among those last records, one line stands out. The road is cleared for the king's return. The writer could not have known that his king would never see Persepolis again. As Darius retreated eastward, loyalty dissolved behind him. Satraps surrendered to save their provinces. Generals defected to the rising star of Macedon. The great king, once surrounded by thousands, found himself traveling with only a handful of guards. His letters, preserved in fragments, speak with the weary dignity of a man who understands that he is no longer history's subject, but its witness. "Let no one destroy the lands of Persia," he wrote. "If the gods will it, I shall restore them." The gods were silent. In the mountains of Bactria, betrayed by his own kinsmen, Darius was struck down before Alexander could reach him. When the conqueror found the body, he ordered it wrapped in royal cloth and sent back to Persia with honor. It was an act of respect and of appropriation, Alexander laying claim not only to Persia's empire, but to its myth. In Persepolis, preparations began for a funeral that would never be witnessed by its subject. The palace servants laid out incense and gold vessels. The priests read the prayers of kingship one final time. The terraces filled with light as the ceremony concluded, but the feeling was not triumph. It was the hush before transformation, the awareness that the age of the Achaemenids had ended, though their city still stood. The empire Darius left behind was not conquered in the usual sense. It yielded, slowly and with grace, to a new language of ambition. The administration remained, now serving another master. The roads stayed open. The coins still bore familiar patterns. Only the idea had changed. Where Persia once ruled through divine balance, Macedon ruled through the velocity of human will. For a moment, both worlds coexisted. In the months before its fall, Persepolis continued its routines. The bulls watched the gate, the columns held their shadows. The archivists checked inventories as if the next festival would arrive as always. But the couriers no longer came. The silence that filled the palace was not peace. It was absence. Far away, Alexander's army moved through the Zagros passes, carrying the dust of conquest and the smell of smoke. They were heading for the heart of Persia, drawn by the glitter of a city whose builders had believed that beauty could defeat time. They would arrive soon, and when they did, the world that began with Cyrus and was perfected by Darius the Great would meet its reckoning in flame. They came at dawn. The mountain wind carried dust and the low murmur of marching feet, and before the sun rose fully above the plain, the Macedonian army had appeared on the horizon, a slow-moving tide of bronze and blue banners. From the terraces of Persepolis, the sentries could see it glittering like a mirage, drawing closer with every hour. No alarms sounded. The city had waited too long for this moment to be surprised by it. Doors were barred out of habit, not defiance. The scribes sealed the last of their tablets and left them where they were, unsure whether anyone would return to read them. For 2 centuries, Persepolis had represented the permanence of empire. Now, as Alexander approached, it would test how permanence ends. The gates opened without resistance. The gate of all nations, once the ceremonial threshold of the Achaemenids, received the conqueror with its usual calm. The colossal bulls watched as the new king entered, flanked by soldiers who had marched from the edge of the Aegean. To them, this was the heart of the wealth they had been promised, treasures taken from cities long forgotten, gold piled like grain, and the seat of the monarch who had once called himself master of the world. Alexander's generals expected plunder. Instead, he hesitated. For days, he walked the terraces in near silence, studying the reliefs, the pillars, the carvings of kings seated beneath the winged symbol of Ahura Mazda. Some said he felt awe, others said guilt. He had grown up hearing of Xerxes' invasion of Greece, the burning of Athens, the desecration of temples. Now he stood within the city that symbolized that memory, unsure whether to revere or avenge. The treasury revealed its secrets reluctantly. Its chambers opened onto rows of stone benches stacked with ingots and coins, gold and silver from every corner of the old world. By some accounts, more than 3,000 talents of gold were carried out, a fortune so vast that it required 10,000 mules and 5,000 camels to transport. The soldiers who entered its cool corridors spoke in whispers, as if afraid of waking something ancient. At first, Alexander treated Persepolis as a prize to be preserved. He ordered the satrapal palace guarded, the artisans protected, the archives untouched. But the city's quiet unsettled him. Its beauty was unyielding, indifferent to conquest. To rule it was to be judged by it. The Greeks who followed him saw ghosts of tyranny in its columns and called for vengeance. The Persians who remained moved like shadows, mourning in silence. In that tension, fire waited for its spark. The night it came was heavy with celebration. Banquets filled the halls where kings had once held council. Wine flowed freely. Torches flickered against the frescoed walls. Musicians played in every courtyard, and dancers moved between columns that cast long, trembling shadows. The conqueror sat among his companions, Thais, the Athenian courtesan, Ptolemy and Perdiccas, his generals, soldiers drunk on triumph and fatigue. Someone raised a cup to the memory of Athens, to the revenge long owed against Persia. Thais, it is said, rose and called out that the gods themselves demanded a reckoning, that the city of Xerxes should burn as Greece had burned. The story changes with every telling. Some claim Alexander laughed, others that he hesitated. But when Thais took a torch and threw it against a curtain, the flames caught like truth. The silks flared, and the air filled with the scent of cedar and oil. Within moments, fire leapt across the hall, devouring tapestries, beams, and pillars painted with gold. The soldiers cheered and followed, torches raised, their revelry turning to frenzy. Outside, the wind carried the blaze through the complex. The cedar roofs roared, collapsing into themselves. Heat shattered the stone veneers, and molten gold dripped from the lintels. The bull-headed columns of the Apadana glowed red against the night. Some of the Macedonians tried to stop the fire, but it was too late. The terraces became rivers of flame, and the sky above turned the color of bronze. Those who witnessed it said the sound was unlike battle. No shouting, no clash of metal, only the vast exhalation of a city dying. The smoke rose straight and steady, visible for miles, until the mountains themselves seemed to darken in mourning. Beneath the destruction, parts of Persepolis endured. The underground storerooms of the treasury, carved into the bedrock, survived the inferno. So did the fortification archive, its clay tablets baked hard by the heat that consumed everything above. Ironically, the fire that destroyed the city preserved its memory. By morning, the terraces were a ruin of ash and light. Columns stood like trees stripped of leaves. The carved nations along the stairways wore faces blackened but unbroken. Alexander walked through the embers, his companions silent behind him. The triumph had turned hollow. Later chroniclers said he wept, others that he ordered water thrown on what remained. Perhaps both are true. In the ruins, victory and regret are indistinguishable. He lingered there for weeks, as if unable to leave. In that time, he issued orders for rebuilding, for offerings to Persian gods, for the respectful burial of Darius's body. He called himself the new king of Asia, heir to the men whose palaces he had just burned. The contradiction did not trouble him. Conquest never does. To the Persians who survived, the fire became a wound too vast for blame. Some said it was vengeance for Xerxes' impiety, others that it was madness sent by the gods to humble both nations. In later centuries, poets would call it fate, the moment when arrogance met its mirror. The archaeologists who uncovered the city millennia later found the evidence still there. Vitrified bricks melted by heat beyond measure, carbonized cedar beams, melted gold pooled in corners, fragments of pottery fused into glass. The pattern of destruction followed the wind, beginning in the royal apartments, spreading through the harem, and dying out at the far end of the terrace. Even the walls bear the scars, stone once pale, now streaked with the color of fire. In the months that followed, Alexander marched eastward, chasing horizons. The empire of the Achaemenids was gone, absorbed into his vision of a single world. Persepolis never recovered. The terraces were abandoned to the elements, the canals dried, the gardens withered, but the ruin remained visible for centuries, a monument not to conquest or revenge, but to the moment when human ambition mistook destruction for renewal. At sunset, long after the fire, the mountain cast its shadow across the plain. The bulls at the gates, cracked but still standing, faced east as they always had, watching the path where the first kings once came and the last conqueror departed. The smoke had vanished, but the silence it left behind would last for ages. When the last embers cooled, Persepolis lay open to the wind. The cedar roofs were gone, the courtyards layered in ash, and the carved faces of kings stared blankly through a haze of ruin. Only the mountains remained unchanged, standing like patient witnesses above the desolation. The city that once embodied the order of the world had become its opposite, a monument to impermanence. The Macedonians moved on. Alexander's army marched east in pursuit of horizons, leaving behind charred columns and the faint smell of resin that lingered for months. The conqueror had taken the gold and the glory, but the city itself refused to vanish. Even in ruin, Persepolis defied oblivion. Over the years that followed, the site became both legend and ghost. Greek settlers wandered through its ruins and spoke of it with reverence, calling it the palace of the ancient kings. Soldiers camped among its shattered halls, lighting fires on the same stones that had once supported thrones. The Persians, who remained in the valleys below, came to regard it as sacred ground, neither wholly of the living nor of the dead. The tombs of the Achaemenids, carved into the cliffs at Nakshi Rustam, still stood untouched. The figures of Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes raised their hands eternally toward the winged symbol of Ahura Mazda. For those who passed along the plain, the sight was a reminder that even burned empires could cast long shadows. In the years after Alexander's death, the new rulers of Asia, his generals turned kings, treated Persia as inheritance. Pusestas, one of the conqueror's companions, was appointed governor of the region. Unlike most of his peers, he learned the Persian language, wore local dress, and honored Persian customs. He kept the New Year festivals, maintained the archives, and restored order to the devastated countryside. Under his care, Persepolis breathed again, though faintly. The terraces were swept clean, the surviving halls used for ceremonies and storage. For a generation, the ghosts found stewardship. Fragments of that period still survive, Greek inscriptions beside older Persian ones, hybrid dedications that invoke both Zeus and Ahura Mazda. The two worlds coexisted awkwardly, one declining, the other still unsure of its permanence. Persia had become an empire remembered by its conquerors. In time, the Seleucids, heirs to Alexander's legacy, ruled from distant Antioch. Their officials saw the ruins not as sacred, but as quarry. Columns were cut for stone, bronze melted for coin, reliefs chiseled away to decorate new shrines. Yet even desecration could not erase the grandeur. Travelers described the site as the work of giants. The locals called it Takht-e Jamshid, the throne of Jamshid, after the mythical king who was said to have ruled in the dawn of time. The memory of Cyrus and Darius had become legend, folded into mythic antiquity. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell across the same plains. The Parthians, the Sasanians, the Arabs, each adding their own layer of interpretation. To the Sasanians, Persepolis was a link to their divine ancestry. They carved their own reliefs beside the older ones, claiming kinship with the Achaemenids. In one inscription, Shapur I boasts of victories over Rome beneath the silent faces of older kings, as though conversing across centuries. The ruins absorbed each age like sediment. Graffiti in Middle Persian appears beside Elamite cuneiform. Later, Arabic script overlays both. Stones once polished by imperial ceremony became canvases for memory. The city had ceased to function, but had begun to narrate. Even the earth conspired to protect it. The same ash that destroyed Persepolis sealed its archives. In the treasury and fortification rooms, the fire baked thousands of clay tablets into permanence. Hidden beneath collapsed ceilings, they waited while languages changed, while roads vanished, while new faiths redrew heaven. When they were finally unearthed millennia later, they would speak again, the living record of a world that believed administration could be eternal. For nearly 1,000 years after the fire, Persepolis lay half-buried. Villages grew near its base. Shepherds grazed flocks among fallen columns. On certain nights, when the wind moved through the ruins, the people said they could hear music, the echo of festivals, the procession of nations still climbing the stairways in silence. None dared stay there after dusk. The place was too alive with memory. Medieval geographers who passed through the Fars region wrote of a fortress made by Solomon or Jamshid. They described its pillars of impossible size, its carvings of beasts and kings, its stairways that seemed meant for giants. The Farsnama of Ibn Balkhi, written in the 12th century, devoted pages to its marvels, blending observation with legend. He wrote that the stones held the speech of vanished peoples, and that to read them would be to command the world. When European travelers reached the site in the 15th century, they found what they could not name. The Venetian merchant Giosafat Barbaro believed it to be the palace of Queen Esther. Others thought it the tomb of Solomon's mother. The columns still stood, but the meaning behind them had been lost to time. What had once been the script of empire was now an undeciphered pattern of wedges and lines. And yet, Persepolis refused anonymity. Even stripped of context, its beauty spoke across the gulf of centuries. Artists sketched its ruins, poets wrote of its silence, and every visitor felt the same unease. The sense that this was not a ruin, but a presence. Time did what conquerors could not. It turned memory into mystery. The Persians of later dynasties visited the site as pilgrims. The Safavid kings rode out from Shiraz to carve their names beside those of Darius, not as rivals, but as heirs. For them, the city's endurance was proof that Persian identity had survived every empire that claimed to replace it. If one walked among the ruins then, one might have seen the layers of history written side by side, the clean lines of Achaemenid stone, the Sasanian carvings etched nearby, the Arabic prayers scrawled between them, the Persian poems of travelers praising Jamshid's throne. Persepolis had become what it had always sought to be, a gathering of nations, even in decay. The centuries of silence did not diminish it. They refined it. What began as the seat of an empire ended as a mirror of civilization itself. Every visitor who stood before its shattered gates saw their own reflection in the ambition that had built them. When the sun set over the Marv-dashed plain, the light struck the columns as it once had in the time of kings. The reliefs, blackened but unbroken, caught the glow and seemed for a moment to live again. The lion biting the bull, the processions of nations climbing toward eternity. The empire was gone, but its language of order had survived in stone. Persepolis no longer belonged to rulers, it belonged to time. The wind returned first. It swept over the plain of Marv Dasht, lifting dust across the terraces where kings once walked, tracing the outlines of vanished walls. Seasons turned, rains washed the soot from the stone, and grass crept between the cracks. The ruin that had been Persepolis, burned, looted, admired, and abandoned, settled into its long sleep. Centuries passed without witness. The last caretakers faded, the archives crumbled into clay, and silence replaced the ceremony that had once defined the empire. In that silence, imagination took root. The people who lived near the ruins no longer remembered its builders, only that it had been made by beings larger than men. They called it Takht-e-Jamshid, the throne of Jamshid, the seat of a mythical king said to have ruled when the world was young, and the sun itself obeyed his command. Shepherds pointed to the towering columns and said that Jamshid had ordered them raised in a single night. The cracks on the walls, they claimed, were marks left by his jewels. The channels beneath the terrace were veins through which divine fire once flowed. The real Achaemenids had vanished into legend, but their stone had learned to speak another language. Travelers who came through Fars carried those stories westward. Some swore that the site was the palace of Solomon, the prophet king who commanded jinn and spirits. Others said it was built by demons as punishment for defying God. The myths changed with the century, but always they revolved around awe, the human need to make sense of something that endured beyond memory. By the time the Arab geographers recorded it in their chronicles, the name Persepolis had long been forgotten. They described a fortress of 40 columns, Chehel Sotun, the 40 pillars, standing lonely among mountains, its inscriptions unreadable but obviously sacred. The city, they wrote, was cursed to remain unfinished until the day of judgment. To them, the stones carried not history but warning. Even in ruin, the place drew kings. The Sasanian monarchs had once carved their own triumphs into the cliffs nearby, but later rulers came as pilgrims. They left small inscriptions, blessings, signatures, the names of companions. Each age saw in the ruins a reflection of itself. To the conquerors of Persia, Persepolis was proof that empires die. To the Persians who returned centuries later, it was evidence that memory never does. When the Mongols swept through Iran in the 13th century, the city escaped their destruction simply because there was nothing left to destroy. The columns stood half buried in dust, mistaken for the remnants of a divine temple. The Mongol chronicler Hamdallah Mustawfi, passing through the region, noted the pillars of Jamshid gleaming in the evening light, marveling that such artistry could survive when the craftsmen themselves had been lost to time. Life went on around it. Villagers tilled the soil at the mountain's base, drawing water from the same canals the Persians had built. Goats climbed the terraces, children played among the fallen stones. From a distance, the ruins seemed asleep. Up close, they hummed with quiet endurance. The poets of medieval Iran turned Persepolis into symbol. Hafez, writing in nearby Shiraz, spoke of Jamshid's cup, an image of worldly splendor destined to shatter. To him, the ruins beyond the city were not history, but philosophy, proof that even kings must surrender to time. The poets who followed repeated the theme until it became part of Persian identity, the beauty of impermanence, the nobility of decline. Then came the age of rediscovery. In the 15th century, European travelers, guided by curiosity and rumor, began to arrive. The Venetian Giosafat Barbaro stood among the pillars and declared them the palace of Queen Esther. A century later, the Italian Pietro della Valle saw inscriptions he could not read and copied them onto paper, convinced they concealed the wisdom of the ancients. None yet guessed that these marks were cuneiform, the script that once recorded the words of Darius himself. By the 17th century, Persepolis had re-entered the world's imagination. The Safavid kings, eager to associate themselves with Persia's forgotten grandeur, made pilgrimages from Shiraz. Shah Abbas II ordered repairs to the stairways and had his own inscription carved beside the older ones, a gesture of reverence, not rivalry. To him, the Achaemenids were ancestors of glory and Persepolis their eternal court. Yet the site remained a riddle. Scholars debated whether it was the work of Assyrians, Medes, or some vanished civilization. Travelers from Europe filled sketchbooks with its architecture. Chardin, De Bruyne, Niebuhr. Their drawings captured columns half sunken in sand, the mountain looming behind them like a watchful god. The mystery deepened rather than diminished. For the local people, the ruins were still part of daily life. During Nowruz, families climbed the terraces to light small fires, an echo of rituals older than memory. They told their children that Jamshid's throne still waited for a king worthy to reclaim it. As centuries passed, the stones became both monument and mirror, a place where Persia's ancient pride and its modern humility met in uneasy conversation. Beneath the surface, the real city slept intact. The fire that had destroyed its roofs had sealed its archives in earth. Thousands of tablets lay hidden, their characters hard as bone, their meaning unknown. Rain washed over them, dust covered them, but their words remained, messages from clerks long dead to readers not yet born. For nearly 2,000 years, Persepolis endured like this, half ruin, half myth. The world around it changed beyond recognition. Empires fell, faiths rose, languages evolved. Yet every traveler who saw the site felt the same stillness. The stones seemed to wait. Then, slowly, the waiting ended. By the dawn of the 17th century, scholars began to suspect that these ruins were indeed the capital of ancient Persia, described by the Greeks. The first modern excavations were still far in the future, but the spell of myth had begun to break. The throne of Jamshid would soon regain its true name. Still, the legends never left. Even today, villagers in the valley speak of lights on the terrace at night, of music carried on the wind. They say the old kings still hold court when the moon is full, their shadows moving among the pillars. Perhaps they do. Every empire hopes to outlive time. Persepolis alone seems to have managed it. When the sun sets over the plain, the columns turn gold for an instant, just as they did in the age of Darius. Then the light fades, and only the outlines remain, familiar, eternal, carved into the skin of the mountain. The desert has claimed everything else, but not this. Beneath the sand, the city still waits, neither lost nor alive, listening for footsteps that will one day wake it again. For nearly 2 millennia, Persepolis had been a riddle sleeping in plain sight, half myth, half mirage. Then, slowly, it began to wake. The first to disturb its silence were not conquerors or kings, but travelers, curious, uncertain, and often awed into reverence. In the 17th century, the Italian Pietro della Valle reached the plain of Marv Dasht after months of travel through the Persian highlands. He wrote of columns standing like mourners, of carvings so perfect that time itself seemed to have stepped aside. He could not read the inscriptions carved across the gates, but he copied them faithfully, believing them to hold the secret of the world's beginning. A century later, the Frenchman Jean Chardin stood in the same place and called it the palace of a vanished empire. To the Persians who guided him, it was still Takht-e Jamshid, the throne of Jamshid. To Europe, it was the first glimpse of a civilization only remembered through Greek rumor. By the 18th century, more travelers followed. The Dane Carsten Niebuhr, the Dutch artist Cornelis de Bruijn, the Englishman William Ouseley, each leaving behind drawings, measurements, and wonder. Niebuhr copied the strange wedge-shaped characters he found on the walls and columns, marking them carefully into notebooks. Those sketches would later help scholars decipher cuneiform, allowing the voices of Darius and Xerxes to speak again after 20 centuries of silence. The mystery that had once been myth was now becoming history. But even as the scholars of Europe argued over which ancient king had built this place, the people of Iran already knew what it meant. They visited it during Nowruz, lighting fires on the terrace in quiet tribute. Children ran between the pillars, shouting the names of Jamshid and Solomon. Old men recited verses from Hafez. The ruins were no longer merely the pride of a vanished empire, they were the memory of a living one. In the early decades of the 20th century, Persepolis found new custodians. The German archaeologist Ernst Herzfeld arrived with a small team, notebooks, and the patience of one who understood that ruins resist haste. He mapped every stone, traced the layout of palaces, and unearthed tablets long buried beneath collapsed roofs. Among them were foundation plaques of gold and silver inscribed in 3 languages, proclaiming the words of Darius. By the favor of Ahura Mazda, I built this palace. For the first time, the king's own voices returned, not as myth, but as evidence. Herzfeld was followed by Erich Schmidt, who continued the excavations with method and reverence. He took to the skies in a small plane, photographing the terraces from above. Through his lens, Persepolis revealed its full design, the symmetry of the stairways, the alignment of the palaces, the order that had once mirrored heaven itself. Those aerial images, ghostly and exact, gave the world its first complete portrait of the city that had ruled the imagination for ages. Each discovery felt like an act of resurrection. The archaeologists uncovered the treasury archives, the hidden rooms of the fortification tablets, and fragments of painted plaster that still held faint traces of blue and red. The stones that had seemed mute began to murmur again. Lists of workers, payments in wine, offerings to gods whose names had not been spoken for 2,000 years. The everyday returned before the divine, the hum of life behind the grandeur. For the people of Iran, this awakening stirred something deeper than curiosity. It was not the recovery of a lost civilization, it was the recognition of continuity. The same mountains that had once watched over Darius and Xerxes still watched over them. The same sunlight that had gilded the terraces now fell on their own faces. Persepolis, at last, belonged again to the land that had birthed it. The rediscovery was not free of tension. Some saw in the excavations a challenge to modern identity, too ancient, too royal, too distant from the faiths and languages that now defined the nation. Yet even those who doubted its relevance could not deny its beauty. The ruins stood beyond argument. They were neither Greek nor Persian, pagan nor sacred. They were the memory of civilization itself. When the dust of excavation settled, Persepolis revealed not only architecture, but intent. Every block of limestone, every staircase and relief spoke of the same vision that had animated Cyrus and Darius: unity through order, diversity through peace. The archaeologists, standing among the columns, found themselves humbled by the precision of a world that had lived and died before their nations were conceived. Even the silence had meaning. In the uncarved panels left unfinished, they saw hesitation made eternal. In the baked clay tablets, bureaucracy turned to art. What the Achaemenids had sought to make harmony visible had survived its own destruction. The 20th century brought new eyes and new reverence. Scholars translated the inscriptions. Poets reimagined the kings as symbols of endurance. The ruins appeared on coins, in classrooms, in the minds of all who looked for continuity between ancient and modern Persia. The name Persepolis, once buried under Jamshid's legend, became again what it had been, the city of Persians. Still, the stones carried their own warning. Herzfeld once wrote that Persepolis is not a ruin that died, it is a ruin that remembers. To walk among its halls was to feel both triumph and loss, the pride of what humanity can create, and the grief of how easily it can burn. By the late century, conservation replaced excavation. Scholars turned from unearthing to preserving. The air around the terraces filled not with hammers, but with brushes, soft and cautious. The city no longer needed discovery. It needed care. What had been the seat of empire had become a shrine of endurance. When the evening sun falls across the marv-dashed plain, the same light that once crowned Darius still washes the columns in gold. From above, the pattern remains flawless, terraces aligned with stars, stairways mirroring constellations long vanished from the sky. For a moment, time folds. The past breathes through the present, and the city lives again, no longer a symbol of dominion, but of memory reclaimed. Persepolis had been conquered by kings, destroyed by fire, buried by legend, and reborn by curiosity. Now it stands simply as itself, proof that the dreams of a civilization, once carved in stone, can outlast even the empires that dreamed them. Even now, when the wind moves across the plain of marv-dashed, it carries the sound of 1,000 chisels. The city may be silent, but it remembers the rhythm of its making, the cadence of stone answering hammer, of dream turning into form. 2.5 millennia have passed since Darius the Great laid its foundations, and still the terraces of Persepolis rise like a promise kept against time. At sunset, the light finds the columns first. They catch it and hold it, turning pale limestone into molten gold. Shadows stretch along the stairways where the 23 nations once marched, their faces carved in calm devotion. The lions and bulls still face each other in eternal struggle, not as enemies, but as balance, strength and restraint locked in a dialogue that has outlasted kings and conquerors alike. Every empire leaves behind its language of power. Some speak in monuments of conquest, others in the architecture of faith. Persepolis speaks in silence. It was never a fortress, never a city meant for everyday life. It was an idea given body, the notion that order could be beautiful, and that beauty itself could sustain belief. When the modern world rediscovered it, Persepolis became more than archaeology. It became memory made visible, the point where myth, history, and identity converge. The scholars who brushed dust from the reliefs were not merely uncovering stone. They were reawakening an entire civilization's reflection of itself. The kings who had built these halls believed that to act justly was to build eternally. Their empire is gone, but their idea survived, in art, in language, in the will to endure. The city's endurance is both miracle and warning. Its stones have resisted wind, rain, fire, and neglect, but not indifference. Time still gnaws at the carvings. The limestone softens, the reliefs weather, and the bulls guarding the gate of all nations lose a little more of their faces each year. Yet restoration continues, quiet and patient, as though the living have taken up the work of the dead. Today, Persepolis stands protected not by empire, but by remembrance. It belongs to all who value what civilization leaves behind when its banners fall. The world has named it a heritage of humankind, not because of conquest or gold, but because it teaches endurance, the art of lasting without domination. Each visitor who walks its stairways repeats, in gesture, if not in language, the procession of nations carved in its walls. During Nowruz, people still come from across Iran to celebrate the spring beneath its pillars. Families picnic among the stones. Children climb the same steps where envoys once carried tribute. The air fills with laughter, not ceremony, but something of the old reverence survives. The sun sets, fires are lit, and for a moment, the ruins look whole again. The empire has become community. The monument has become belonging. In this transformation lies Persepolis' final triumph. It no longer needs power to be powerful. The city endures not as the seat of kings, but as the heart of a memory shared by millions. Its image adorns coins and books. Its columns rise on murals and currency alike. But no symbol can capture what it feels like to stand there when the air is still and the mountains glow faintly with dusk. When you realize the same horizon that crowned Cyrus now stretches before you unchanged. The city has become time's mirror. Every era sees itself reflected there. The ambition of the ancient, the curiosity of the modern, the longing of all who come after. To the Persians, it is inheritance. To the world, it is proof that beauty can outlast the politics that create it. In the last light of day, Persepolis ceases to be a ruin. The terraces dissolve into gold and shadow, and for a heartbeat, the city returns to what it once was, a vision suspended between earth and sky. The columns no longer seem broken, but waiting. The reliefs no longer still, but breathing. The stairways alive with invisible procession. It is as if the centuries have folded, and all the kings who once believed in eternity have kept their promise after all. When darkness finally falls, the outlines remain. The mountain behind it glows faintly, and the air still hums with the silence of ceremony long past. The wind rises, whispering across the stones, tracing the paths where priests, envoys, and workers once walked. It carries no words, only continuity, the same invisible thread that has bound this place to the living world since Cyrus dreamed it into being. Persepolis endures not because it survived destruction, but because it transcended it. Empires burn, belief endures. Fire could not erase its meaning, nor could oblivion diminish its grace. The city's strength lies in its vulnerability, in the way its broken columns still reach upward as though seeking conversation with the sky. Perhaps that is its final lesson, that all civilizations, however mighty, are temporary, but what they strive to express, the longing for order, for beauty, for understanding, can outlast even their names. In that sense, Persepolis never truly fell. It simply changed language. And so it remains, on its terrace beneath the mountain, not the ghost of an empire, but its memory, its music, its soul, the dream that began with Cyrus, perfected by Darius, crowned by Xerxes, and preserved by time itself. The eternal city, carved not for dominion, but for remembrance, a testament to what humanity can build when it believes that beauty and order are worth eternity.